unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hamlin, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to the second half of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels. And for those of you who have joined us fairly late, then you do know we are internationally syndicated via Late Night in the Midlands with the terrestrial stations in the United States, as well as Deprogram Radio Network in the United Kingdom, as well as their terrestrial stations. Today we have a super guest for you, another dual show, 2 hours, 2 guests. This second hour, we bring to you Dr. Daniel Estulin. He is a researcher, a writer, a public speaker, a senior political advisor, analyst, film director, producer, and a foreign policy advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staffs of 2 Latin American nations, and he was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. I think the resume really speaks for himself, and we are going to be speaking, among many other topics that he'll be joining us in the future for, on his new book, In the Shadows of a Presidency. Dr. Estulin, welcome to the show.
It's great to be. It's an honor to be on your show. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I've been wanting to have you on ever since I literally just heard about your book, so I'm finally excited we're finally here. Now, my favorite documentary right now, and I know the listeners are going to wonder, how the heck is Dr. J thinking about this? But it's only because of what has happened in the last 2 years. There was a television show on Showtime called Circus, and it documented the 2016 election. At the end of the year, they took all the footage and created a 2-hour documentary called Trump's, the greatest political upset in history. November 8th, 2016 was a defining moment in the United States. And Dr. Estulin, I want to ask you, why do you think that day changed America forever?
Well, it actually is a defining moment in the sense that these kinds of things happen once in a lifetime. We could talk about the Black Swan event. We could talk about Halley's Comet. And Trump was pretty much that. Although, to be really honest with you, we, meaning the Russian intelligence, we knew back in 2014 that not necessarily Trump, but someone like Trump would win the elections. I can actually tell you the exact date. It was November 5th, 2014. It was the day off of the day after the midterm elections. It was at the Dartmouth Conference in Dayton, Ohio. And we're sitting around with the American delegation and some other people from some other countries, and it has nothing to do with the Russiagate and Mueller's silly investigation. It was just an international conference. Important people were there, and after the concerts, we were schmoozing, sitting around and talking. And we said to the American delegates, we said, we started obviously talking about what had happened in 2014 elections with the Republicans, the trending, winning the elections. And we said that we think that 2016 elections, somebody from the Republican Party, but somebody who's not a liberal banking financier is going to win the elections. They kind of looked funny at us, so we explained to them. We basically had 3 candidates we thought could go and win the elections. One was Rand Paul. We thought he had the political know-how, but he lacked the business acumen to actually do something. So we kind of discarded him right away, although he was one of the finalists. Then we thought of Bernie Sanders as a left-leaning liberal, and someone like Donald Trump as a right conservative. Bernie Sanders might very well have won the elections had all the shenanigans that happened in the Democratic National Congress, but the Trump part surprised the Americans, and we explained to them why we thought that someone like Donald Trump, keep in mind, it was long before Trump decided to run.
Yes, 7 months, actually.
But basically, because if we understood from the point of concept, because again, I'm a doctor of conceptual intelligence, meaning that we see things from way up high. Like if you're in an airplane at 10,000 meters or 36,000 feet, you're seeing things, what is happening on the planet Earth level. That's what we do. So we explained to them that the reason we thought that no liberal banking financier, by that I mean Hillary Clinton being the face of that group, liberal banking financiers, Wall Street, the people who play with numbers on the computers, people who speculate, who don't produce anything at all, parasitical order. We thought that none of them could win the elections because they had caused the collapse of Bretton Woods economic model, which was created back in 1944 by the winners of World War II, and it was based on this concept of infinite growth on a finite planet, which, needless to say, can't exist. And it was also based on another concept. It was based on a concept of having, obviously, the dollar as the emission center of the United States and having that as the reserve currency for the entire planet. But because there was no such thing as infinite growth, and because we're seeing it right now more than ever, more than in 2014, we said to them, somebody from an opposite team, an alternative, would have to come in because the model, which has been going since 1944, is now dead. And because the model is dead and there's no infinite growth on a finite planet, we started looking at alternative candidates. And Donald Trump is not a person as much as he's a project. When I say he's not a person, I mean he's an extraterrestrial. What I mean is he's a project. He's a face of an alternative group of people, whether you want to call them the isolationists, whether you want to call them the industrialists. But the idea is the liberal banking financiers, the people behind Hillary Clinton, are Wall Street, the establishment of Washington, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, mainstream media, the intelligence agencies, George Soros, the Rockefeller. These are the people behind Hillary Clinton. And behind Donald Trump, you have the European aristocracy, you have the European royal families, you have Vatican, you have the Rothschilds, you have the city, not London, but the city, the epicenter of the British Empire, you have Singapore and Hong Kong city-states. These are the powers who would lose absolutely everything in case of a collapse that we're seeing right now. So again, back in 2014, we sat at the Dartmouth conference in Dayton, Ohio, and we explained to the American delegates at the conference why someone like Donald Trump definitely had a very, very high chance of winning the elections. And here we are, midterm 2018, and Donald Trump is the president of the United States.
And not only is he the president, Dr. Estulin, he actually has kept more promises than any other candidate who made promises and has followed through with them. And like you said, he is an outsider, an anti-establishment. If the dynasty queen, Miss Hillary Clinton, won again, it would just be a repeat. We would have been at war with Russia, China, because in their minds, the best way to fix the economy is to start a war. We're going to funnel money, guns, down to the soldiers' shoelaces, to their food, and then we destroy a country, kill a lot of people, and then we go back and build it up. But Trump, on the other hand, saw another way to fix the economy. And I think that's one of the great things and why back in 1980, when Reagan ran and Roger Stone was able to identify the Reagan Democrats, I think those same Reagan Democrats in 2016 are what voted for Trump. What do you think about that?
Well, actually, it's an interesting point. Actually, the reason, when I said a few minutes ago that Trump being the alternative group and behind me of the Vatican, European royalty, European aristocracy, etc., you keep in mind one thing, that the real reason why Trump won, because it was close in a lot of states, is because you had within the Latin community, and you can ask, and because I have a lot of Latino followers, because I speak fluent Spanish, I lived in Spain for 24 years, a lot of them have confirmed via Twitter and other media that the priests in churches throughout the United States, Latin-speaking, basically told the Latinos of the United States to vote for Donald Trump. And again, that would come directly from the Vatican. So Hillary Clinton and the Democratic crowd, they completely misjudged, thinking to themselves that the black vote and the Latino vote was the Democratic vote, and that was not the case. Because what we're seeing right now, why is the Vatican so interested in dismantling Hillary Clinton? Because Hillary Clinton represents a liberal banking financier, globalist, parasitical order. People who don't produce anything at all, and these are the people who have dismantled the economic model we're seeing right now, which is Bretton Woods. And that's gone and that's dead, and we're looking for an alternative model. So Vatican will be one of the interested groups in that Hillary Clinton wouldn't be elected. I'm not trying to say that Donald Trump takes orders from the Vatican. I don't want people thinking that or saying that or writing it or repeating it. That's not the case. These are the groups behind Donald Trump. They supported him, and obviously the result of their support is his presidency.
Now, you mentioned globalists. New World Order is a term that Herbert Walker Bush. I know the listeners are absolutely know why we shouldn't have a New World Order, because I know it's going to end up into some sort of fascist or a tyrant leading it, or a bunch of oligarchs running us. But can you explain from your point of view why allowing, if Hillary had won, or allowing any sort of president, it's fortunately not Trump, would to have a new world order, to sort of give up control of the North American alliance, which is Canada all the way to South America, and to merge with the EU, the African Union, and whatever comes around from the east. And once you have those four factions, then it's pretty simple to put them all into one. What dangers do you see if we were in a new world order with one government?
Well, first of all, one of the things that's happening right now is the dismantling. One of the consequences of the destruction of Bretton Woods economic model is the need for an alternative economic model, which right now doesn't exist. There are a few ideas out there, and world order is not really one of them. Plan is, if you kind of look historically, Global 1.0, you can call it, was a period between 1648 Westphalia and the late 1960s of the 20th century, when at the Bilderberg Conference, they created this thing called One World Company Limited. But, the initial period over, 200-year period between 400 years, 1648 and 1968, was a period where you had nation states, meaning countries, constitutions, borders, laws, regulations, countries with their own currency, etc. Then a new period in 1968 started called One World Company Limited, where you had corporations that had more power than any government on the planet, and the Bilderberg is actually behind this at their 1968 meeting in Mont-Tremblant, just on the outskirts of Montreal in the province of Quebec in the country of Canada. And now we're in Global 3.0, which is post-industrial world of networking. And one of the things we're seeing right now is because the economic model is dead, and the reason it's dead, and it's important to understand because, again, you're hearing a lot of talk about one world order, new world order, one world government. That kind of stuff might have been possible way back when, but today it's not possible. Because, you see, between 1944 with Bretton Woods and 1991, you had two economic models. You had the Western capitalist model, and you had the socialist Soviet model and their satellite states, and the two coexisted pretty much, pretty well. The Western capitalist model had certain advantages from a point of view of the economy, and the socialist model, from a point of view of social welfare, social net, et cetera, et cetera. Demographically speaking, they were pretty much on par. The Soviet Union had 300 million people, and the United States at the time, I can't remember, 220 or something like that. And then in 1991, what had happened was that the two models, the socialist and Western, they merged into one. We're not going to go into why the Soviet Union collapsed or how it was put together. Going back to the 1960s with the Soviet nomenclatura, meaning the oligarchy, the leaders of the Soviet Union basically agreed with the West, dismantling the country and making it part of the global order. It's not the place or the time to do it. But the point is that in 1991, the two systems became one. And whether it's before, the Western capitalist model controlled about 62 or 63% of the world economy, and the socialist bloc controlled the rest. Once the socialist bloc merged into one, this global pan-liberal banking financier order, the expansion period lasted what it lasted basically up until now, because once you take over someone's territory, you expand. But once that expansion period is over, because you need to sell your things, you need the external markets. That's the whole thing about the economy. Growth is only based on you being able to sell your things to someone else. But when they conquered the Soviet bloc, and they've lived for the past 30 years, off that Soviet bloc, but that period is now over. You've come to the point where you have nowhere else to expand. So we cannot talk about global one world order, new world order, one world government, because the model doesn't work. It only works under a liberal banking financier system. So they have a problem, and that's why shortly after 9/11, the financiers, because 9/11 was a watershed moment, because the capitalist West rejoiced for about 10 years saying, hooray, we won the war. But they only won between 1991 and the year 2000. Then if you remember the year 2000, we had the dot-com bubble. Then in 2008, we had Lehman Brothers collapse.
Yes,
and so the banking financiers, globalists, call it deep state or whatever you call them, they realized that their model, was on its deathbed. And so beginning shortly after 9/11, they've been talking and thinking privately and secretly in all these different kinds of meetings how on an alternative economic model. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is the discussion of dismantling countries and creating regional economic blocks. And, for example, what you're seeing in the United States with California wanting to secede from the Union, it's not a coincidence that somebody wants to pay $200 billion for Baja California, that's the Mexican part of California, and create whatever, country they want to name it, Greater California. But the idea is that in Europe alone, you have over 60 independent movements. Catalonia is one, Lombardia, Northern Italy is another. You have Scotland, you have over 60 of them, of these independent movements across Europe. So the idea is you need to dismantle countries and create regional economic blocks. We've come to the point of limits to growth. There's nowhere else to go. And all these conflicts you're seeing right now, the world over, from the Civil War in the United States, and I think you have to agree that, the United States is at war with itself. There's no other way to look at it. All the stuff that's happening in Latin America, anywhere you look in Europe, you're seeing the same thing. England is the same thing with Brexit. Russia, Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, China, Japan, no matter where you look, for the exception of maybe Fiji. Everywhere else, it's hell on earth. And Donald Trump, again, going back to Trump, he is the consequence of the dismantling of a particular model which has been working and going since 1944, because economically speaking, there's two ways you can do it. You have an open model, which means you steal from someone else, as the British Empire has done, as the Spanish Empire has done, as the Americans have done for so long, bringing democracy to every nook and corner of the planet. But that's over because they have nowhere to steal from. They have stolen from everybody. They've expanded into the limits of the planet Earth, and now it's done. Or you have a closed model where you're actually producing something, improving something per square kilometer of space against nature. And that's why Donald Trump, when he became president, I think it was the first or his second speech, where he said infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't necessarily mean only bridges and ports and railroads. It also means infrastructure of algorithms. And that's why the war today between China and the United States is not so much between the countries, but between the two platforms, Alibaba versus the Amazon. And again, if we understand all this stuff in context, the background to the whole thing is the economy, and that's something that people don't understand.
Right now, what you're seeing with the left is them going even further left, Democratic Socialists of America, and you just mentioned socialism, Marxism, communism. They're all sort of based on Karl Marx's ideas, but the thing is all that communism, socialism, anytime it existed, it's good. The idea sounds good on paper, but implementing it is never really worked out for everybody. Now, here we have people that are finally wanting to embrace capitalism more than ever before. Do you know why people are so split in wanting to go towards the socialism route as opposed to the majority who want to stay on the capitalism route?
I think, again, what it basically comes down to is the fact that people look around them and they see how you're seeing the dismantling of the world economy. People are hurting. They're being harvested by the governments, and they're looking for something just and fair. From the economic point of view, the meltdown is now here. And, what happened last week or the week before, this is just the beginning. This isn't the end. Now things are going to get better again. This is not over by a long shot. It's just the opening salvo. Think of, this stuff we're seeing right now, this meltdown, because what had happened to Russia in the 1990s, known as the Rape of Russia period, where the Clintons and company and the Bushes came in and stole everything that wasn't nailed down to the floor and lived off Russia for the next 20 years up until Trump's election to the presidency. So think of the meltdown as stocks playing catch-up to economic realities. And those are the economic realities of a slowing global economy, deflating housing bubble as a result of the Fed rate hikes, amongst other things, trade war with China. So each of these realities had an asset class warning about what was to come. We could talk about copper. We could talk about home building. We could talk about China's stock market, which is down 32% on the year. We could talk about, personal loans. Any one of the myriad of bubbles out there. So all of these suggest stocks are going lower. It's no longer a question of if. It's a question of how much. And if you remember the Great Depression, they dropped 90%. So when people think of equity, that they're wealthy on paper, they have, 3 cars, 4 mortgages. They have, 2 houses, somewhere, where they can go have their summer vacations. And they have the stocks and bonds, et cetera, et cetera. For those who think that all this stuff happening right now in the stock market, that the Fed, again, is going to save stocks, I think people have to think again. I warned people in 2008. I wrote about it in my book In the Shadows of the Presidency on Trump's election. The Fed is not concerned about stocks, and he's going to sacrifice most people, for the sake of bonds. You see, when stocks collapse, investors lose money. They lose everything. But when bonds collapse, entire countries go broke. So with that in mind, once the U.S. bond market began to collapse, basically pushing yields above their long-term trend line, it became apparent that the Fed would sacrifice stocks to save bonds. And the reason? Because you let stocks collapse will force capital into bonds, thereby forcing yields lower. And to go back to what you said earlier, people understand that the situation is very, very hard. They think it's going to get better because most of them read the mainstream publications, and they don't know better that the mainstream media is part of the global elite, be it Bilderberg, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, or any of these other organizations. So if you kind of look at what's happening right now, we can talk about the American economy again, because again, the backdrop to everything, whether it's this terrible stuff that happened yesterday in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, or this past week stuff with with this bomber crazy individual, or the Kavanaugh election, or the millennials, or the stuff you're seeing in San Francisco, the backdrop is the collapse of a particular economic model, and the fight between, well, I'm going to say Clinton and Trump so people can understand, but it's not Clinton and Trump. It's the opposite conflicting models or groups of people looking for survival is to the death. And that's what we're facing right now.
2008, as you mentioned, the Lehman Brothers collapsed, the entire housing bubble collapsed, and of course they were shorting the CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and other things like that, where essentially they were betting against the housing market. And so what does the president of the time do, George W. Bush? Bailout. And I never saw how that would benefit anybody but the big banks. And I am worried that they're going to start doing the same thing again. As a matter of fact, they have new names for things like CDOs now, and they're still shorting them.
They can't. You see, the problem is they can't, because no matter how much money they pump into the system, and I'm going to tell you an interesting story that most people don't understand, that Donald Trump, I'm going to say this, I'm not afraid to say this, and people are going to say, what? But I will explain. Donald Trump is the continuation of Barack Obama's second-term economic policy. Before you hang up the phone and never want to speak to me again, let me explain. If you remember, the timeline, 2000, you have the dot-com bubble, okay? 2008, you have the Lehman Brothers. Between 2008 and 2014, the U.S. government pumps $2.5 trillion into the market. And the difference between the U.S. government and when you and I go shopping, we don't have the money, we can't buy anything. We can just window shop. But they have this funny little machine that prints money. So they printed $2.5 trillion. But what had happened was, going back to the 2000 crisis, the global elite circles, they understood very, very well, because they know the economy, that their system was dead. And although they control every emission center of the world, except the United States sent emission center. Emission meaning a machine that prints money, okay? Emission is to print money. And what they wanted to do, and they had a deal in place, the treacherous liberal banking financiers of the United States, meaning Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, all these people, they had a deal in place, a secret agreement with International Monetary Fund, and I explain it in the book, and nobody knows anything about it. The deal was that the Bank of International Settlement, which is central bank of central banks, would come in and take over the United States dollar as the international emission center, but it would be under the control not of the Federal Reserve or the United States government, but under the control of international global bankers. Do you remember what happened in 2010 when Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was the general director of International Monetary Fund, and this woman, I can't remember where she was from. We do know that she had fairly questionable character, okay? And he was caught in New York. And Dominique Strauss-Kahn, for people who don't know, is a member of one of the oldest elitist families in the history of Europe, whose roots go back to about the 5th or the 6th century, St. Clair's. They even talk about it in the Da Vinci Code as being one of the oldest aristocratic families in Europe.
Yeah.
And what had happened was, okay, when Barack Obama organized this whole thing with Dominique Strauss-Kahn and this black woman of questionable character, it was a way of letting international bankers know that he was not going to let them control the United States dollar as the emission center of the international financiers. And then in 2011, Obama, for the first time since Reaganomics in 81, got rid of all the members, international members of Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan from his Economic Council. In 2014, we have Obama stopping quantitative easing, meaning he stopped printing money. And in 2016, we have Brexit and Donald Trump. So again, I explain it in detail in my book, In the Shadows of the Presidency. Donald Trump is the continuation of Barack Obama's second-term economic policy. But again, one of the things that people don't understand is how is it possible, and why did, first of all, Obama stop printing money in 2014, and how is it possible that the American government printed $2.5 trillion, but there was no inflation when a Venezuelan government, for example, prints 2.5 trillion bolivars, and they have like 100 million% inflation. And the reason is, and this goes to the heart of the issue of why Trump is in a very difficult predicament, and the Americans who go out and vote on the 6th of November, you have to vote for Donald Trump. I'm not saying it because I'm for Donald Trump or against Donald Trump. I can't be for or against because I'm not American. But you do have to vote for Trump, because if you vote for anyone else, we're going to go back to the way things were, which means thermonuclear war, because this is the only thing that the liberal banking financiers have. That's the only way they can write out debts and responsibilities. So what had happened was, going back to the $2.5 trillion, although he printed $2.5 trillion in cash, there's a thing called a credit multiplier. Okay, and that credit multiplier, it's a mathematical formula. It dropped from 17 to about 4. So although the amount of cash in circulation went up by a factor of 4, this credit multiplier went down by a factor of 4 to 4. And basically what happens was, if this multiplier goes below 4, it kickstarts a process called non-payment crisis. And this is what happened in Russia in 1998 when the ruble collapsed, the economy collapsed, and the country defaulted. So Obama couldn't print more money because the multiplier would have gone under 4, and that would have kicked this non-payment crisis. And this is what happened with the U.S. economy. And Trump's predicament right now is exactly that. The reason the liberal banking financiers behind Clinton or whoever it is, and I don't mean on the Democratic side, because I hear a lot in the mainstream media, people talking about Democrats versus Republicans. People understand it's not between the Republicans and the Democrats, because I remind you, the Bushes voted for Hillary Clinton. And the reason they voted for Hillary Clinton, and it's very important people understand this, it's not between parties, it's transversal, meaning both the liberals or both the Democrats and the Republican parties, they represent global economic liberal banking model. Both, I repeat, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they're not two separate parties separated by abortion. Both of these parties traditionally are controlled by the liberal banking financiers, be it George Soros, be it Rockefeller, be it Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, whoever. They both represent failed Bretton Woods system. And if we want to change that and save not only the United States but the world, We have to make sure Trump doesn't get impeached because in baseball parlance, because we are in the playoffs, okay, the liberal banking financiers are down to their final strike. It's ninth inning, and they're down to the final strike. If they don't impeach Trump after the midterm elections, meaning by winning both the Senate and the House of Representatives, Trump wins in 2020, and he goes on and dismantles the liberal banking financier order with his regional partners, meaning people like Vladimir Putin, who's not a commie, KGB, pickle-eating Ruski who kills dissidents in the morning and eats them in the afternoon. Because Putin and Trump are right-wing conservatives. Putin is not a communist. He's a right-wing conservative. That's why Donald Trump, after the first meeting in Helsinki, said it was one of the best meetings he's ever had, and he's looking forward to the next one, because they're right-wing conservatives. So it's important for people to understand, first of all, Trump is the continuation of Obama's second-term economic policy. When Obama realized that this whole thing is going to collapse, he stops printing of money, and then you have all these other things happen, and Donald Trump is one of them. And as a consequence of that, what we have today is a choice between alternative group, meaning Donald Trump, as a member of the isolationist, call it whatever you want to call it, be that isolationist or industrialist base, meaning people who actually do and make something that you can touch. And that's 30% of the global economy, versus 70%, which is financiers who make numbers on a computers, who don't produce anything at all, who are basically parasites, who suck blood of the entire world economy. And it's not Democrats or Republicans. You got to vote for people who are going to push the agenda, which puts America first. And putting America first, you're putting the interests of non-globalists above their interests.
It's not, like you said, Republicans versus
No,
Democrats,
it's not.
because as you've shown, they've always been together. I mean, like you said, the Bushes voted for Hillary. They wanted her to win after Jeb Bush was not going to carry the dynasty name. It's not, I'm going to make this clear again for the listeners, that it's not Republicans versus Democrats as much it is establishment versus non-establishment, as in Donald Trump being non-establishment.
I don't know if that's the case. Donald Trump may not be establishment. I mean, he's not. But the thing is that the people behind him, the Rothschilds, European aristocracy, the Windsors, meaning the Queen of England, Singapore, Hong Kong, City, which is the epicenter of the British Empire, they're very much establishment, but they're an alternative group because the Rothschilds are working with China. Which brings me to another interesting point, which you brought up at the very beginning, and I made a mental note of it. This whole thing with China and the United States, this trade war, it doesn't exist. It's absolute nonsense from an intelligence point of view, of conceptual intelligence. Because, again, remember one thing. China is not China. China is China and the Rothschilds. All this talk about, because, again, you see, in 2012, the Rockefellers lost and the Rothschilds won. Who are the Rockefellers? Rockefellers are the money bankers. They're the financiers. They're the people who do percentages in the bank. The Rothschilds are the changers. They change money, they change drugs, they change diamonds, they change gold, they change silver. They're the changers. And that's why you're looking at a different contour where the Atlanticism per se is dead, and now the entire energy is going towards the east, meaning Pacific region. And what we have seen, for example, a few months ago is an interchange of interests. Basically, this whole thing with the trade war is a way for the Americans and Chinese, each goes to their sphere of influence, meaning the United States shut the door and control the United States. That's what Make America Great Again is all about. And the Chinese go to China because, again, Trump shuts the door and we have the dollar model, not the petrodollar, which is a model of his enemies, the liberal banking financiers. Because, again, one of the mandates for Donald Trump's presidency, dismantle the petrodollar system because it's the system of his enemies, the liberal banking financiers, whether it's the Chinese going back to their sphere of influence, to a two-contour system, meaning yuan, their currency, supported by physical gold, and the second contour, electronic money, to get rid of $4 quadrillion debt, because the global debt today is $4 quadrillion. That's number 4 and 15 zeros for people wondering what kind of a number that is. Because
4,000 trillion, right?
Yeah, 15 zeros. So the idea is, because you can't write off quadrillions of dollars of non-existing values through physical gold, you can do it, though, through the electronic money. And that's what you're seeing right now, the two contours. And that is why the next point, because one of the things I think it's important for people to understand is we are led by the mainstream media, by the parties, by the deep state, towards this dialectic, us, them, good, bad, black, white, God and devil, man, woman. And it's a fight between always two groups. Because while we're fighting against each other, we're missing the bigger picture. So what I want people to understand is we need to start thinking independently. One of the things, for example, we're seeing right now is there's a lot of talk, and I talk about it in a book written a year and a half ago because I knew it was coming. A lot of talk right now in the media that oil possibly would go to $200 a barrel. I talk about it in my book, which I wrote and published a year ago in Spain and about 3 months ago in the United States. Why? Is that good for the United States or is it bad for the United States? Well, it depends. For Donald Trump, $200 oil is great. Why? Because it would dismantle the liberal banking economy. Because, again, remember, when we're talking about the United States, it's still under the control of the liberal banking financiers. And although Trump is making inroads and he's winning, he's far from having won. Because, again, remember, these people, and by these people I mean bankers, financiers, think tanks, foundations, secret societies, private organizations like Bill Leber, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, mainstream media, the business schools, be it London School of Economics, Wharton School of Business, foundations, all of these organizations, not to mention the government itself, have been controlled since 1944 by the liberal banking financiers. And so it's very difficult to think when you have something controlling society worldwide for over 3 generations, how Trump, and he has done incredibly well in 2 years. But again, he's far from winning because you see how much stuff is leaking through his cabinet, how many enemies he has within the intelligence community, within his own government, the media, on a congressional level. So again, Trump is fighting a good fight, but he's far from winning this war, which is why it's very important for people to understand. You have to vote Republican when the midterms come in 2 weeks on the 6th of November.
Let me ask you about George Soros. You brought him up, and he is someone that I've always worried because there's even allegations that he is actually paying a lot of the people that are coming from the caravan from Central America to get it in here. What is his agenda?
Well, again, conceptually speaking, George Soros is part of the liberal banking financier agenda. If you think of democracy being run by the Democrats, think of liberalism being run by the bankers. Okay, and one of the things about bankers, if you have absolutely no responsibility to anybody but yourself, and you do whatever you want to basically get hold and control and dismantle whatever you want out there. And this is what George Soros and the Rockefellers and the liberal banking financier establishment has been doing for a very long time. And Trump goes in because people say, well, no, but George Soros is American. He has America's interest at heart. He does not have America's interest at heart. He never did. Rockefeller, he may have an American passport, but he is not an American. And in his book, his biography, he talks about that. He's a globalist. His area of influence is the entire world, and he's only American because that's where he has his main bank. That's where he has his home front. But he's not American as far as the heart is concerned, as far as the interests are concerned, or the well-being of society is concerned. And George Soros is exactly the same thing.
You mentioned the IMF and Trilateral Commission. I'm going to throw in the Federal Reserve Bank. What can you explain to everybody why these 3 institutions are not good for humanity? And do you think, the second part of the question is, do you think they will ever be abolished?
Well, because, again, when we're talking about Donald Trump's enemies, let's expand on the list that I said before. Not only the mainstream media, the intelligence agencies, establishment of Washington, but you have to understand, when people are saying Trump is insane, I mean, he's fighting against Prime Minister of Canada, our friend. He's going up against, Theresa May in England, our friend and long-lasting ally. He's fighting against the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. He sits down to have breakfast with the General Director of NATO, and he criticizes him. He does the same with International Monetary, World Bank, the President of France, Macron. These people are not America's friends. They're not Trump's friends. They're his enemies. Because International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organization, they're Bretton Woods institutions. And for all those people who keep saying that Bretton Woods is dead and died in 1971 when Nixon took the peg of the dollar, please explain to me what is International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Trade Organizations. They're institutions of the Bretton Woods economic model, wearing a different mask, but part of the liberal banking financier model. And Federal Reserve is exactly the same thing. So whether you're looking nationally in the United States or internationally, we have to understand that although the mainstream media wants to portray Donald Trump as this crazy kook who does unseemly things in a Moscow hotel room, which is needless to say all nonsense. The point is, Trump is picking a good fight, and he knows who his enemies are. Because, again, Canada, England, France, Germany, Italy, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organizations, they're all institutions and representatives of this global liberal banking financier parasitical order, which needs to be dismantled because the only way they can survive, and they know it, is get rid of Trump through the elections and then impeachment. And because what they need is they need to get access and control of the emission center, meaning the machine that prints money. That machine no longer makes a difference because no matter how much money you print, you're not seeing any growth whatsoever because there's so much money, physical money out there. But this physical money is not giving these people any benefit and any growth, which is why we need to come up a new economic model. And Trump and the people behind Donald Trump, the Rothschilds, etc., they're working on it. One of the ideas, again, is regionalizing global economy where you create regional economic blocks. And for a regional block to work, you need a minimum of 300 million people or even 500 million people. So, for example, one of the ideas, and again, I explain it in detail in my book, would be Canada, the United States, northern part of Mexico, Australia, New Zealand. That would get you to, somewhere like 500 million people. That would be a dollar system. Then you'd have the rest of Mexico and Latin America. That would be a second block. Then you have, Europe, Paris, Berlin axis. Russia would be divided into two regions, east and west by the Urals. China would be a separate region. India would be a separate region. And then, you have England and London and the Arab countries. So, again, that's one of the ideas at work right now. Another is creation of, again, Americans go to the United States. They shut their door. You Make America Great Again. You have your model based on the dollar. And the Chinese have their model. And that puts the Russians in a predicament where we have to come up with a different economic model. One of them is the rebirth of the great Orda, the Chinggis Khan. That's one of the ideas. Russia and China working together. Not possible at this moment because Russia today is a liberal banking financier, and Donald Trump has exactly the same problem as Vladimir Putin. They may agree very quickly because they're both alpha males and they can speak to each other and understand each other because they're right-wing conservatives. But Trump and Putin are surrounded by traitors. And so they don't have a team behind them who can actually get things done. And that's why these midterm elections are so important, because by winning, Trump can put his own people in key positions and keep pushing against this liberal banking financier global order, which is on its deathbed. But again, being on its deathbed and being dead are not the same thing.
I'm glad you brought up Russia and Putin, because I'm curious, from your standpoint, working for the Russian Federation, what do you think is going on in the government around the people? You said Putin is also surrounded by traitors, as is Donald Trump. Do you ever think that the Helsinki meeting, something like that will happen again, and Russia or Putin and Trump will work together as Trump was hoping to work, which seems to fall out of favor now with the nuclear treaty, the demise happening with the Russian
You
nuclear
have to,
treaty.
again, read it in context. I repeat, Trump is surrounded by traitors. And sanctions against Putin, this is just such a resource. Yes, the stability of the dollar system in this particular case is falling, critically falling. But Putin's demonization and sanctions, you have to agree, is an element of total demonization, has become the main tool for preparing for elections and organizing the impeachment of Trump. Because you see, what Trump needs more than anything else are tranquil, peaceful elections and run up to the elections, and all the stuff that's going on. The bomb packages. The assassination of 11 people in a synagogue yesterday. I'm not saying that somebody is doing this on purpose, but because again, working and looking at things from a point of view of conceptual intelligence, you have to agree that if you're Trump, and you want a very quiet run up to the elections, he is getting anything but. And this whole thing with Congress and Senate forcing Trump to put sanctions on Putin because they're putting sanctions on Putin, because if Trump doesn't follow suit and doesn't add on to Senate's or Congress's sanctions with additional sanctions, the mainstream media is going to portray him as being soft on Putin. They're already doing it. So he has to show his hand. He has to say, if you're doing this, I'm going to up the ante. But he doesn't want to do it. He's being forced to do that by the mainstream media, by the deep state, by the intelligence agencies, and by the traitors on both sides of the aisle, both the Republicans and the Democrats, which is why, again, it's transversal. It's not the Democrats against the Republicans. They're both working together, and they have a common enemy, Donald Trump. Because, again, if you don't demonize Putin, you have no chance of winning in November, and thus no chance of getting rid of Donald Trump. Because Mueller's commission and its conclusions, I think you'll agree, are a laughing stock for the entire world. And, of course, the risks are high, because the game is for keeps. So the fight is not only for who will control power, but who will live and who will die. And so we're basically left with one question, for the point of view of the liberal banking financiers, how to seize control over money printing. Because the longer Trump remains president, the stronger these forces that stand behind him are, as well as their hold on power. Trump, in fact, can lose, but because, again, Trump is not a person but a project. So if the elite, somehow make him disappear, or something happens to him, it doesn't really make a difference because he represents an alternative group, and that's what's so very, very important to understand.
You brought up a while ago that Nixon stopped using the gold to back the dollar, and I think that we, in the last 47 years, and soon to be more than that, the fact that we no longer have a gold-backed monetary system is what's causing these people to run amok when they print money and cause inflation. But yeah, you even pointed out in 2014 when Obama printed that $2.5 trillion, yet we didn't have inflation. What's it going to take, Dr. Estulin, to bring back a gold-backed system? Because if we just have money and that's all electronic, that people can just hack into a computer and change balances, and yet there's nothing tangible to attach it to, that is how I see that we're just going to blow inflation out of the water, and so much more corruption can exist when it comes to money.
As we come to the second half of 2018, and I should say to the end of the year, 2018, the heat has been turned up dramatically, not only financially but also politically, socially. I mean, again, the United States is at war. It's something which, from the Russian intelligence point of view, we predicted way back in 2002, 2003, because, when people say United States against China, it is not United States against China, United States against Russia, because America today is not a homogenous country. If people say it's United States against China, explain to me Clinton versus Trump. Black Lives Matter against the police, the National Rifle Association against all these lunatics, the millennials, all these silly, crazy, irrational movements out there going up against, everything, that the Republic has stood for since the beginning of the United States. Because, you see, the financial coup d'etat, and it is a financial coup d'etat, drained trillions of dollars. Right now it's at 21 trillion, although Catherine Austin Fitts thinks it's almost like 50 trillion of assets from sovereign governments, pension funds, municipal and community institutions, and households. So the debt growth model is over, okay? And the cost of capital for these existing institutions is rising. And so what remains in the existing institutions are liabilities. So we're currently witnessing an acceleration of controlled demolition of existing liabilities. As pension funds, there's a $3 trillion hole in the pension funds in the United States. Think of that. Insurance companies and businesses must renegotiate or basically abrogate their contracts. Sovereign governments who have the capacity to print currency and to issue more debt absolutely must engage in a deeper re-engineering of government assets and operation. And so the most important question before the United States as we come to this very, very critical period in not only America's but world history is whether or not the country will re-engineer the return on investment to taxpayers of government investment, also credit and contracts, appropriations and regulations, from a negative to a positive return. And if they do, then the United States will create explosive growth. And if they don't, the country is in for a very long, harsh financial squeeze at best, civil war at worst, perhaps even a repeat of rape of Russia, with a very, very important difference. We, in Russia and then before that in the Soviet Union, we've lived through hunger, we've lived through Second World War when 26 million of my countrymen, died defending the motherland. We've lived through a lot of hardships. The United States has not. But the rape of Russia period and all this other stuff is coming to the United States. And I think the Americans are terribly, terribly unprepared for what's coming.
I definitely agree with that. And that's why I know this midterm election coming up, literally November 6, 2018, is a big deal, and as will Trump's re-election in 2020. I think those are two defining factors that the world will absolutely be looking on. We are coming down to a close. I do want to thank you for all your information on here, and all you people listening, believe me, Dr. Estulin will be back. I just want to ask you again, Dr. Estulin, why, I know you've mentioned why people need to go vote, but how much of an impact, I guess this would be the final statement to ask you, and then anything you want to say, of course, after that, how big of an impact will the November elections have globally, not just to the United States and what we're doing here, because the world is paying attention to what's going on?
Well, because again, let's look at two alternatives. One alternative is Democrats win, Democrats being the people behind Clinton, and the transversely. If the people against Trump, if they win, they're going to look for any way possible to impeach him. If they get rid of Trump, they're going to bring someone like Clinton. It doesn't matter if it's her or someone else. It's irrelevant. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to start printing money again. In about 6-8 months from now, this money is going to come back to the United States, creating enormous inflation, which is going to make all the bubbles explode even faster than they will explode with the current financial crisis. And that leaves the globalists with one solution, and that's global thermonuclear war, because, again, wars write off debts and responsibilities. So people are saying that's never going to happen. They're going to kill 4 billion people. They might kill even more. As Mao Zedong said way back when, he said, if they kill half of the world's population, we are 1.5 billion people, and we will survive. So the Chinese will survive. The elite will reorganize the world on a much smaller scale because they will survive, and most of us will perish. Russia will survive because it's a very large country land-wise. The United States will not because it's a much smaller country. So again, we must make sure that doesn't happen, because one of the things, going back to the very beginning of Trump's presidency, Trump committed in the eyes of the elite this cardinal sin when he said he was open to negotiating with Putin, and compared Putin's strong leadership to of Russia unfavorably to Barack Obama's weaknesses. So, and then he compounded that by defending the sovereign nation-state system against the globalist vision of world government. Then Trump linked economic collapse to the collapse of culture. He declared war on drugs and on the role of the money laundering Wall Street banks. He endorsed Glass-Steagall banking separation, which would bring the elite casino economy to a halt. He spoke about advancing science, exploring space again and conquering disease. And then, finally, I know we're running out of time, on March 20th, 2017, he committed perhaps the gravest offense of all in the eyes of the elite, directly embracing the American system of political economy, the economic science which actually built the United States and which the elite thought they had completely replaced by their free trade and globalist New World Order. So yes, people do come out. I'm not American. I'm Russian. We are not your enemies. We are your friends. We work together, and we have to work together because we're two nuclear superpowers, and only Trump and Putin working together can dismantle globalist New World Order.
Well said, and I think that is a very impactful statement that you said, that we do have to worry because these are literally, I think, the two biggest global superpowers, and we both are very armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, so that is definitely something of concern. Dr. Estulin, if you could briefly talk about where people can buy your books, there's more than one, and of course your website.
The easiest way is, or you go to Amazon. The book is called, my latest book on Donald Trump is called In the Shadows of a Presidency, and it's unlike all these other books out there that bring up all these salacious details about Trump's personal life. This is irrelevant to the well-being of the planet Earth. What Trump does in his private space, who he does it with, where he does it, how well he does it, is absolutely irrelevant to the global economy, to the global well-being of the citizens of planet Earth. So this book unravels the entire edifice of the global structure, and we do it from the conceptual intelligence point of view of someone who is very close to a lot of the decision-making processes which are done on the supranational level. Again, the book is called In the Shadows of the Presidency. They can get it through Amazon, or they can get it right from my publisher, Chris Milligan of Trine Day Press, a small but very, very good publisher, Trine Day Press. People can also follow me on Twitter. It's at Estulin Daniel, and my webpage is english.danielestulin.com. Again, english.danielestulin, ESTULIN.com. And of course, my world famous book, The True Story of the Bilderberg Group, is another interesting topic. But again, Bilderbergers, they're just part of the liberal banking financier elite, and perhaps next time I'm on, we can touch on them as well.
Absolutely, Dr. Estulin. We will bring you back for both topics. Everybody, you will have him back. And let me just say this, folks. I say this every show. The only thing you need to remember when it comes to the show is the name of the show. That's Dr. J Radio Live, DRJ Radio Live. For instance, the website, drjradiolive.com. Every single social media account is the same, at DRJ Radio Live, including Facebook, Google+, Flickr, Instagram, YouTube, Tumblr, Buffer, YouTube, I said YouTube, Twitter, Minds, and Patreon. Literally, folks, that's the only thing you need to remember, at DRJ Radio Live. Also, folks, remember to create a Minds account. It is the new open source social media that does pay you in cryptocurrency. It's based on Ethereum, and I do hope you all go there and subscribe to this channel. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J, and I am a